Let's start this meeting and must excuse the absence of our Vice President for the Research, Guillaume Plantin, who had to leave France for an international meeting. I introduce myself. I am Marc Lazin, Professor of Political History and Sociology at Sciences Po and Director of the Center of History. And in the name of Guillaume Plantin, it's my pleasure to welcome you officially to this Rendezvous de la Recherche. What are these appointments for the research? It's a moment of dialogue between the scholars of Sciences Po and scholars coming from other universities, and I thank all of them for their participation, a dialogue between us and the large audience on a specific topic. This rendezvous, as you know, are dedicated to populism, and as usually for this kind of rendezvous de la recherche, this meeting will be completed by a publication of a magazine which is called Cogito. Cogito is the magazine of the direction of the research, and for this month of April, it will be dedicated obviously to populism. So you will receive, all of you, next week, the publication in French, dedicated to populism of this magazine Cogito. And at the beginning of the month of May, you will receive the English version. And that will be an opportunity for you, I hope so, to take a subscription to this Cogito magazine. So today we're going to speak about populism. Obviously, it's a wide topic. We know perfectly that we have great discussions about the content of the notion of populism. We will not speak so much today of that. We know that there is a huge literature dedicated to this topic. Sometimes some scholars insist on the fact that populism is a thin ideology, but an ideology. Others insist on the fact that populism is more a style. But today we decided to really try to understand the reason of the rise of the populism, and that will be the first panel. And the second panel will be dedicated about the experience of populists where they are in power. And we know there is now a long list of countries where the populists are in power. All the two panels will be each one of 1 hour. We will have different presentation of papers, quite short, quite brief, to later space to the discussion and to your questions. For asking the question, you can use the Q&A possibility, and if there are too numerous questions, we will have the obligation to select them, and that will be the role of Hélène Naudet. And I thank Hélène for the organization of this panel, for the management of the interaction with the audience, and also for the next publication of Cogito I was speaking about. I thank all the colleagues for the presence and for the participation to these two panels, and I give immediately the floor to Yann Algan, Professor of Economics and Dean of Sciences Po Public Affairs. Please, Yann, up to you.
Thank you very much, Marc. Hi, everybody. This is a real pleasure to welcome such a large audience and distinguished colleagues to talk about the determinants of populism during this first panel. So obviously, there has been a lot of literature trying to understand the causes of the rise of populism. Especially, there has been a number of studies trying to distinguish what is related to the economic roots of populisms, especially linked to economic insecurity in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and then the digitalization of our economies, or coming from the globalization of the Western economies. There has been a lot of literature also on the cultural causes of populism, especially called the cultural backlash, with a search for cultural identity from middle classes who have lost grounds during the last 30 years. To try to introduce this panel, we have a real pleasure to welcome two international specialists of this literature, with first Catherine Nevry. So thanks a lot, Catherine, for being with us. Catherine is the Dean of Diversity and Inclusion Chair at Bocconi University and a professor of political science. And we will welcome also Sergei Guriev, who is professor of economics at Sciences Po, and who has published a lot of papers, of books, and also a literature review, a wonderful survey on the causes of populism. And we suggest to have a discussion on two sides of this phenomenon. The first one looking much more at the supply, which is related precisely to the agenda of the different populist party, and another perspective with Sergei and Catherine, looking also at the demand side, related really to the demand from the voters, especially to cope with the economic or the cultural uncertainty of our time. So what I suggest, Catherine and Sergei, is really to leave you the floor 15 minutes each. Then we will have a moderation and enough time for a Q&A session with all the audience. Catherine, maybe you want to start?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you also very much, Marc and Hélène, for the organization and for the invitation. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully that works in one go. Can you see it? Perfect. Okay, thank you. So just linking up to what Jan has said, and I'm really happy to be here in such a distinguished set of speakers, is that I'm going to talk more about the supply. So I'm going to talk about the origins of populist parties, but more as a way of strategy, of the strategies that these parties employ. And I think Sergei is going to look more also to demand aspects, so I think it will be very complementary. So it's going to be also based on, although I'm giving the talk on a joint book that last year came out, which is called Political Entrepreneurs, and I'm going to talk about this, which has been specifically about party supply, that's been co-authored with Sarah Hobart at the London School of Economics. So populist parties, as Jan has already talked about, have been on the rise across Europe, and also familiar patterns of party competition have undergone change. So we've seen really the rise of populist parties. Here are some on the left and the right, but also the steady decline of mainstream parties. These populist parties on the left and the right of the electoral spectrum are political entrepreneurs that have gained a lot of electoral traction. And what they did is basically very much is highlight the mobilization of new issues that had not really been part and parcel of debate. And also by fierce attacks on the political establishment. So you can think of course, about Marine Le Pen in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, but also of parties on the left, like for example, Podemos in Spain, or also the Socialist Party in the Netherlands. But actually now there's been a little bit of a discussion if maybe the tides are also turning again for these populist parties, and if we're witnessing a little bit of a revival of some mainstream politics. We saw it during the early stages of the pandemic that across the globe, many mainstream parties, at least at the beginning of the crisis, the first weeks and months, gained a bump. There was a rally around the flag that some citizens, in contrast to normal times, in crisis times, maybe want competence and competent government. And some populist parties have been losing ground. Think, for example, of the Alternative for Germany in Germany that has not done that well. Also other populist parties in my home country, the Netherlands too. And there was a bit, articles coming in the newspapers about, well, is this maybe the end of populism? And just as I think we've made too much of the rise of populism, we're making too much of the decline of populism. And I think we really need to treat these parties as almost part and parcel of the political debate and how they operate and think about their strategies. So this revival of mainstream, we've seen also recently, may turn out to be short-lived. Just think of the opinion polls and the troubles in the Christian Democratic Union in Germany, for example, and might also exacerbate when the government support of the pandemic measures will fall out, and the real economic fallout and the unequal economic fallout of the crisis might come to bear. And I think also Sergei might talk about that. So while it's notoriously difficult really to kind of predict future events, especially in the middle of a pandemic, I wanted to turn a little bit to the past and think about how in the post-war period we can see these parties, and that populist parties employ a lot of things that we see in other parties in waves of other big political change. And that's the concept of challenger parties that Sarah and I have outlined. So while populist parties is clearly distinct, and in the way that Mark also already suggested, maybe a thin ideology with particular forms of also style, they also belong to a broader category of challenger parties. And what we did in this book is study political change in Western Europe in the post-war period. And really, you know, if we look at the rise of populist parties and the rise and wane of them in certain elections, through the lens of challenger parties, we can basically place it in a broader historical context and identify the core strategies of these parties, but also maybe the core strategies of mainstream parties in competing with these parties. So, you know, while pre-pandemic there was kind of a media coverage as if all political party systems in Europe were imploding, and the impression that, you know, not much was going on anymore, you know, we would kind of wanted to kind of circumvent that image and say, well, there's actually been also a lot of stability. This is in our book where we basically plot in the last 100 years, so from 1920 to 2020, we plot the electoral vote share of party families. So think about Christian democratic parties, social democratic parties, liberal parties, traditional party families at the bottom. So those are in dark blue, red and yellow. And then the newer political parties that, you know, we've seen green parties, radical left parties, radical right parties, and also regionalist parties actually, right? So what you see here is actually also quite a lot of stability, especially for conservative parties on the right. But we also see shifting patterns throughout history. In the 1920s and 30s, we saw the rise of social democratic parties, were actually the challenger parties of that time, the outsiders of that time. We saw, of course, in the 1940s, we saw the rise of the far right, or early 30s, and fascist parties. Then post-war, the emergence of radical left parties, and the liberals going into decline. In the 1980s, we saw the wave of green parties, which maybe also, you know, is increasingly happening now. Then we saw again a wane a little bit of the radical left, and we saw actually recently in the last decade, where we've been talking about, really a wave of populist right parties. And parties actually rise and wane, as we see, and it might be also the case with populist parties, because sometimes this political innovation works and sometimes it runs its course because voters want different things. So what explains the rise of challenger parties in these kind of recent decades? So while commentators and scholars have provided a series of a very important interpretation, we also think that it's important to think about the strategies that parties employ and how these strategies also play a role, because we don't see a uniform patterns of breakthrough across countries and not across time. And one thing that we argue about is that basically that the strategies of these parties might explain that difference. And for that, we don't only should look at these political outsiders, but also look at the strategies employed by mainstream parties to compete with them and how successful these are. So what we basically highlight in the book is that political change, in the same as economic change on the marketplace, is based on two competing forces: the force of dominance and the force of innovations. So those are the forces that also shape economic change and the fate of companies in the important work of Schumpeter. So by drawing an analogy on how firms compete for market share, we argue that politics is then also the struggle between mainstream parties to keep their dominance. So some of these mainstream party elites that party families that I talked about, and then political entrepreneurs that aim to chip away at the dominance of these market players. And we conceptualize parties on the basis of their the position in the marketplace. And we argue that that's really what is key in politics. What explains dominance is the extent to which you are in power. And also the next panel is going to talk about that with populist parties. So dominant parties are those that are in government or have recently been in government. and challenger parties that are those that have never held in power or only for a short time. And in the book, we look at this binary, are you in government or not, or the share of experience, how long you've been in politics. So then political change really is this tug of war between mainstream parties that are trying to protect the things the position they have, and challenger parties like right-wing populist parties that are trying to unseat this. So one of the reasons why traditional mainstream parties have been so dominant is basically two reasons. One is mechanical. The party system often favors traditional forces, but also other is psychological. The links, as in brand links of parties to particular parties. So the political marketplace is not fully free and fully competitive, but rather one that's traditionally, mechanically, and psychologically favored dominant parties. So it's been difficult to break through for challenger parties, as we see in the past. It sometimes takes quite a long time. But recently, we've seen much more electoral volatility and much more room for populist parties, especially, but other challengers like Greens also to move in. So why is that the case? Because the bonds, the mechanics have not really changed. Party systems haven't really changed so much, but the psychological barriers to entry have lowered for challenger parties. The bonds between dominant parties and voters have loosened. Here, I give you the electoral volatility in several countries across time. I can give it the same for partisan attachment that we've seen has declined. Electoral volatility has increased. Why is that? Well, voter fidelity to traditional parties has diminished through large-scale societal changes. Think declines in religiosity, waning trade union membership, women entering the labor market, immigration, shrinking industrial working class. And this figure illustrates that these changes has also been reflected in how people vote. And as new generations come in, the links to traditional parties are less clear. And some of the social organizations that have developed those links, like trade unions, have been on decline in many countries. So as a consequence, even though the mechanics might favor dominant parties in certain systems that are not so proportional, that don't allow for so much change, the fact that the bonds, the psychological bonds between dominant parties and voters have weakened, it allows a window of opportunity for challenger parties and strategy to come in play. So then the next question is, well, we actually have many challenger parties, just like startups, that want to enter a market. And the majority of them, we have a appendix in the book. You wouldn't know how many new parties there are that try to compete in elections. The question then is, why are some more successful than others? And that's what we're trying to address. And why have then populist right-wing parties been so successful? So we basically say that innovation is successful when it comes in a dual package, in a package of policy innovation and rhetorical innovation. So innovation is only going to be successful when so the key question is, when and why do challenger parties break through? The policy innovation is that they introduce issues that drive a wedge, a divide in established coalitions and within dominant parties, something we call issue entrepreneurship. And rhetorical innovation is that these parties use anti-establishment rhetoric to weaken the competence advantage, the government experience of parties, and make them seem out of touch. So innovation, we show also in the book, actually only the twofold innovation is successful when you do both, is only going to be successful when competitors cannot quickly copy the innovation of the radical right challenger party, for example, of the populist party. Because if you have widespread innovation, it diminishes the electoral benefits, but also then the chances for other parties to come in, because you can't gain much from innovation. So we expect parties to engage in innovation, to emphasize issues that have a high level of appropriability, that allow parties to appropriate them. And appropriability is not, patents or anything. You cannot do that in politics, say this issue is mine. But what you can do is introduce an issue that's really difficult for your competitors to deal with. So if it's an issue that splits the constituency of your competitor, like immigration has done, European integration, also to some extent the environment, those are issues that don't fit nicely on the left-right dimension of competition, and they are really easy to appropriate, make it difficult for other parties to react. But just to make sure that you can then, keep a first mover advantage of that policy innovation and don't see copycats in innovation, what challenger parties also do, like right-wing populist parties, is that they basically brand the other parties as copycats, as not the real thing, as out of touch. So they engage in a rhetorical innovation as well, using anti-establishment rhetoric. And we show also that this is some of the reasons why voters also are, both in terms of the policy innovation and the rhetorical innovation, likely to vote for these challenger parties. So the policy issues that are the most divisive have been things like immigration, like European integration in politics, and then anti-establishment rhetoric is really a way in which parties can ensure that mainstream parties don't simply copy their innovation, and therefore the innovation will be void. So the other additional advantage of that rhetorical innovation is that you devalue the brand of the mainstream party. So you make sure that voters and new generations that come into the system do not see these parties as real competitors for your vote. So here, just some innovation showing the policy innovation between challengers and dominant parties, that we measure the level of policy innovation much higher among challengers than dominant parties. It's based on manifesto data, but it can be done on others. Then also the level of anti-establishment rhetoric. So how much is this used? This is done by expert surveys. We've also established a machine learning algorithm to get it from a party text and from manifestos. But you also see challenger parties engage in that kind of anti-establishment rhetoric, also often anti-system rhetoric, much more than dominant parties. So I wanted to end a little bit on the question of it's about now, this particular panel, in terms of what can we expect in the COVID pandemic. So does the pandemic mean this end of challenger parties and end of right-wing populist parties and a revival of mainstream incumbents? So if we conceive the political market space as a struggle between long-standing dominant parties and disruptive challengers, we can understand why challenger parties are not always going to be successful, but might, for example, in a pandemic, do less well compared to a dominant party. Why? Because challenger parties thrive by attacking the expertise of dominant parties, by attacking the competence issues, and also by highlighting issues like immigration that have fallen to the sideway in the pandemic and are not the ones that thrive from kind of showing off their managerial skills. For dominant parties, it's exactly the opposite. They are the parties that are trying to kind of gain electoral responses from highlighting their managerial skills that might have bumped up from an effective government response to the crisis. So this is one of the likely reasons that at least last year, it's now slowly going out as performance is becoming more clear. We saw this rally around the flag, this bump for mainstream parties. And often also challenger parties lack government experience. Populist right parties also quite often, not always, as we will see later, but they often shout from the sidelines and criticize the government. So then you're also seen as a less credible crisis manager for voters. So this led then last year to many people say, also in the FT, big headlines, this is all over, populism is over. So at the moment in time, we wrote a response in the Washington Post already saying, hey, hold on, wait a minute, guys. This is not going to likely be the case. Let's not go from first, saying that every populist was going to be in government to now saying that every populist was going to lose. So while it's tempting to conclude on the basis of the crisis that at least the early responses led to mainstream and a rally around the flag, this is not necessarily the case for the long term. We already see that now people are getting fatigued with the pandemic. We see that crisis response have not necessarily been that good, and vaccination rollouts have been quite slow so far. So that, put some cracks in that competence. But also what is really important is that it's unlikely for the demand of these parties to dry up as soon as immigration becomes an issue again and European integration or the environment gets polarized. We have an increasingly volatile electorate. It's not going to simply dry up, and not the least when a pandemic will trigger a long-term period of unequal economic consequences that certain people are really going to, feel economic uncertainty. And that's a kind of, system of factors that we know that populist parties thrive on. And a prolonged or a sustained divergence in the economy, or the insiders versus the outsiders on the economy, those that were able to keep their jobs or not, or those who were able to save in the pandemic or not, that then together with nationalist messages of radical right populist parties that scapegoat immigrants and international institutions for their woes might seem more credible and pertinent again in the future. So this means that populist parties, because I see also the populist parties very strong, as I saw, as a part of strategy, of party strategy, given in by a particular form of ideology, that they will find strategies to mobilize this again, and they might find benefits to stay ahead, especially when certain people feel economic different times. So I think we really have to start normalizing radical right populist parties, not in the terms maybe of the messages that they provide, which we could have normative issues with, but the fact that they are now part and parcel of our political system, and they really are becoming a key factor in how we have to understand what competition will look like. So I think they're here to stay, and the question will be on the basis of how well they employ certain strategies and how mainstream parties respond is how successful they will be in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for this really insightful presentation and the framework that you propose in terms of policy innovation and rhetorical innovation really is a really useful one to think about the rise of populism. And your comment on the issue of the competence and credibility is something really key. I just share one thing that really strikes us. We ran a survey in the French contest to ask to the different voters, would Marine Le Pen had been in power, do you think that there would have been more or less death during the pandemic? And even the voters of Marine Le Pen think that would have been more death. So the issue of competence to really manage the main crisis of tomorrow will be something really key also to expand the persistence. So now we have the pleasure to welcome Sergei, and Sergei will provide a perspective much more on the demand of populism and also the key role played by new technologies. Sergei, you have the floor for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Jan. Indeed, I will talk about the demand and the role of technology, which is kind of infrastructure of modern politics. As Jan mentioned, I have a survey written together with our co-author Elias Papagiannou, and here I've just shown you where you can get the survey. I will not be able to cover it in detail. This is a survey which we wrote mostly before COVID, but there is actually a section on COVID, and there we do say exactly what Catherine just said, that you should not write off populists. You would think that COVID is a situation where experts matter, competence matters. And you would think that populists who don't trust experts would actually not observe social distancing, would not respect quarantine and lockdown, would not wear masks, would be skeptical about vaccinations. And therefore, the popularity of populists would almost driven by natural selections, driven down by natural selection. But this is not what we should expect, because even though the COVID is a huge tragedy, still we are talking about less than 1% in all countries, in all Western countries, 1/5%, 1/10% of population dying. So it's a huge tragedy, but it's still not enough to shift people's views on those things. And indeed, as Catherine said, some of the mainstream politicians made mistakes. Some of them have done a great job, but some of them have made mistakes. So yes, COVID was a very important factor that differentially killed more and hit more supporters of populism because they didn't trust science. But and we talk about studies which show that. But still, we shouldn't expect populists to be completely disappearing. Now, as Jan mentioned, this is a survey which is forthcoming in the Journal of Economic Literature, where we go through potential causes of populism. We do look at economic factors, as Jan mentioned, globalization, of trade globalization, rise of imports from low-wage countries, and automation have created losers, especially lower middle class in Western economies, both in US and in Europe, who started to vote for populists. And there is a lot of research on this, well-identified rigorous research, which shows a causal link between globalization, the rise of China as an exporter after China joined WTO, and support for populist parties. The same for automation. And if there are questions, I will talk about identification strategies, the way to identify causal effect. But these are the studies which are quite rigorous and quite convincing. Another thing which happened, unlike those long-term trends of automation and globalization, which was going on for decades, there was a one-off shock of the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and subsequent austerity. And there are studies, including those that we've done together with Jan, where actually Catherine was a discussant in a Brookings panel. But there are quite a few studies which show that crisis really mattered. And crisis undermined the confidence in the elites, in the mainstream, especially in those countries where elites followed the crisis with austerity. And again, if there is time, I will talk about that, discussing the identification strategy, showing the causal link between the extent of the crisis and the rise of populism, the extent of the austerity and the rise of support for populism. So that really matters. Now, as Jan mentioned, it's not only about economics, it's also about culture. And in culture, you have views, values, norms, identity issues, and cultural backlash against what's called silent revolution, the rise of postmodernist values. And in principle, we have some evidence about this, but this evidence is much less convincing. Why? Because here you only have cross sections. Culture changes slowly. So people who identify with certain identities probably had the same views 50 years ago. And so the question is, why now? And the argument that people often put up is it's not just culture, it's not just identity issues, but it's more about the interaction between economic shocks and culture. Roughly speaking, those economic shocks that I mentioned trigger identity issues, trigger cultural divides. And so people suddenly wake up to the reality in which economy doesn't work for them anymore, so they need to find somebody else to blame, and they blame the other. And this is what populists usually do. Populists also say, well, economy is not working for you. This is the fault of corrupt elites. So let's fight corrupt elites. Let's drain the swamp, and so on and so forth. Now, another issue, which is very, very interesting, is immigration. So a lot of populists blame migrants. Now, the question is why, and whether we can actually identify the quantitative link between immigration and the rise of populism. And the answer is, very interestingly, that things are not that simple. Immigration has increased in the last 20 or 30 years. People usually don't understand to what extent the West has indeed welcomed many more migrants than before. So globally, for example, globally, if you look at the number of immigrants around the world, globally, we have 3% of global populations being immigrants today, and we had the same number 25 or 30 years ago. However, if you look into Europe, this number has increased by a factor of 2, from 6% to 11% of population. Today in European Union, we have 11% of population who are born in a different place. And in the US, the increase is not as big because US was an immigrant country to start with. But again, in the US, in the last 25 years, in the North America in general, I would say, the increase of number of foreign-born people was from 10% to 15%, still a huge increase. So it is a salient issue. It is one of the most important issues. And pre-COVID, immigration was the top political or social issue on the agenda of voters. And yet, driving a causal link between immigration and populism is not that easy. So there are a couple of research strategies that can help to identify a causal link, but sometimes this causal link goes in the opposite direction. It's actually interesting to see that in some studies you find causal link between immigration and higher support of populism. And in some studies, the direction is the opposite. People actually have more empathy. If refugees come to live next to them, they actually like the refugees, and they vote against leaders like Marine Le Pen. And so this is something that people underappreciate, but a lot depends on context. A lot depends on the composition of immigrants and refugees. A lot depends on whether refugees actually settle or you're exposed to transit migration. And a lot depends on the intensity of the shock. If there are 3 refugees per 100 natives, or there are 100 refugees per 100 natives. And these things, of course, matter. So let me now talk about the new technology that Jan mentioned. I think this is a very important story that is often misunderstood or underappreciated. And this is based on a paper that we wrote together with Nikita Melnikov and Ekaterina Zhuravskaya that is coming out this year in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. So before going there, I will just remind you the magnitude of increase of populism in Europe. I hope you can see my slides where I showed 4 different charts in the same slide. So here I show you the vote share of populists in Europe in the recent election using different classifications of populist parties. And whatever classification you use, you end up with the same picture. There was a steady increase in the first decade of 21st century, probably driven by automation, by globalization and so on, and acceleration in the second decade. And by now we have 25–30% of Europeans voting for populists, which is roughly twice the level that we observed just 10 years ago. And so what has happened in the last 10 years? The big change in the last 10 years was, of course, the rise of mobile broadband internet, which we call in this paper 3G for third generation of mobile services. So you look at the access of mobile broadband networks in Europe in 2007 and you see a desert. Only if you are in London or in Netherlands for that matter, or in Sweden, you have access to 3G networks, which means fast internet, browsing, viewing pictures, downloading and uploading videos. Today, of course, the situation is different. Today, only Spain is a desert, and only desert parts of Scandinavia are desert. So pretty much everywhere today, you have access to 3G or 4G networks. And today in Paris, you also have access to 5G. But we argue in this paper that politics of 3G is qualitatively different from politics of 2G, and politics of 3G is similar to 4G and 5G. And so basically, this change in these 10 years between 2017 and 2018 really hit incumbent parties, the ones that Catherine calls dominant parties. So here I show you, we divide the whole continent into subnational districts and run a regression for the change in 3G coverage and the vote share of incumbent parties. And we look at party in power, or we look at top 2 parties in power together, and we normalize the initial dot to 0. And you see that if 3G coverage, mobile broadband coverage changes from 0 to 100%, the vote share of incumbents goes down by about 9 percentage points. Huge decrease, more than the overall gain of populists in the elections. And of course, on average, the change was not from 0 to 100%. On average, the change was from 38% to 90%. So the magnitude will be roughly half of this change. Still, it's a huge decline in incumbents' vote share. Now, who picked up those votes? So here I show you right-wing populists, left-wing populists, non-populist opposition, and specifically, I also show you Green Party vote share. And so you see that the beneficiaries of this loss of dominant parties were the populists. Right-wing populists, where this magnitude is 9 percentage points, and left-wing populists, where this magnitude is about 6 percentage points. And this relationship is roughly linear. So if you change from 0 to 0.5 or from 0.5 to 1, you have pretty much the same slope. And basically, as I said, on average, subnational region in Europe increased its coverage of 3G by about 50%, from 0.4 to 0.9. So here you have about 4.5 percentage points, and here you have about 3 percentage points. So in total, 7.5 percentage points increase in populist vote for right plus left-wing populists, and that kind of creates already half of the total increase of populist vote in Europe in the last 10 years. And non-populist opposition didn't get anything, and Green parties, which is very interesting, also didn't pick up those votes lost by the incumbents. And so we show that it's likely to be causal, even though it's just a panel regression with region fixed effects and all kinds of identification tricks we play to show it's likely to be causal. Of course, it can still be coincidental. Yet we argue in this paper, and actually in many other papers, that social networks, which are of course driven by 3G expansion, of course social networks are today accessed mostly by mobile broadband internet. Today, majority of Facebook users, Twitter users, YouTube users, when I say majority, I mean great majority, like 80%, use mobile access. And actually, most of the access to internet today, most of broadband access to internet is actually mobile broadband, not fixed broadband. And so most of that is explaining that social media, social networks may be conducive to populist messages. First, because social networks, social media are what American social psychologist Jonathan Haidt calls an outrage machine. On social media, it is easier to disseminate false messages and critical messages. And so populists seem to be very successful in using that. It's not the first time when populists use new communications technology. You can go back to the first populist party, Americans' People's Party, and its presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, in 1896. He used railroads, he used telegraph, extremely successful. You can also see research, including done by my co-author Ekaterina Zhuravskaya, on Nazis' use of radio, which was extremely, extremely successful. You can also think about use of cable TV by right-wing Republicans in 20th century. But internet and social media are special, and they may be particularly suited for populists. Why? Because zero barriers to access, zero cost of entry. And that means that in television, you need to have money. Even in radio, you have to have money. Here, it's all free. And it also circumvents the mainstream media. This is why populists usually use new technology, because they cannot really go through mainstream media controlled by the elites. And finally, it's also two-way communication. Unlike radio or TV, you get feedback from users. And that creates this feeling that populists are people's people, people's politicians. They represent the people. They communicate to people, and they get feedback. And finally, it's good for disseminating simplistic messages, which is the difference between populists and Greens. We have no green populist parties. Why? Because green narrative is very sophisticated. It's very complex, and it relies on experts. It relies on scientific knowledge. And so in that sense, we shouldn't be surprised that Greens are not so far real beneficiaries of social media. That, I should say, may change. Both green politicians and mainstream politicians, and in some countries, green politicians may become mainstream politicians in the coming couple of years. These politicians are learning how to use mainstream social media, and therefore that may really change. And we saw Joe Biden running a very competent digital campaign. But until today, in the last 10 years, mobile broadband, internet, and social media were actually quite important in explanation of populist rise. Let me stop here, and let's have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Sergey, for this presentation. So we have time for discussion between both of you, but also to take questions from the floor. If I may just start by asking one question, Sergey, how do you explain that internet seems to have benefited more the right-wing populist party than the left-wing populist party?
Well, it's also the magnitudes, and 21st century is the century where right-wing populists were gaining more traction. And so it would be a mistake to say that left-wing populists have not risen in the 21st century. But right-wing populists, on average, gain more votes. And we saw in Q&A questions about inequality. It is something that you have done research on. You show how right-wing populists manage to get away with getting support from anti-redistribution voters who are the same, who are actually poor and hit by globalization and hit by automation. And in that sense, I would say that the message of right-wing, extreme right-wing populist parties is more consistent with this concept of negative outrage machine. Social media are easier to disseminate not just false messages. There is research on this, including this study by Vasugi on Twitter and by Alcat and Gensko on Facebook. It's not just that false messages are easier to share because, well, these messages are more exciting, less boring, but also critical messages, negative messages disseminate more exactly because they are more exciting. And left-wing populists like Mélenchon in France, he's against Europe. He's against elites, but he's not really against others. Left-wing populists are not really xenophobic. So critical messages, negative messages are more common among right-wing populists. And this is where this dark machine of outrage, which social media have been, at least until now social media may be changed, but this criticality, the dark side, the dissemination of negative messages is more suited for the right wing rather than for the left.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergey. So let me share a couple of questions from the audience. First, so Osvaldo is really productive. He has two questions, but two questions on really two topics that you have not really covered in your presentation, and that might be key for explaining the rise of populism. The first one is the role of inequalities and increasing inequalities in a certain number of countries like the US, and the second one is the role of racism. So Catherine and Sergey, if you could also elaborate on those two dimensions.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think just one thing I wanted to say also too, I very much agree with what Sergey was saying of my review of the literature. At least I teach on social media and I haven't done research on that necessarily, but I think also for populist left parties, it was difficult to distinguish themselves from left parties because a lot of their rhetoric was similar. So that always is, whereas on the conservative right and the right, oftentimes this otherness, i.e. the racism that also was discussed, was something that a lot of conservative right parties steered clear of, right? Because that was too much and had a, in the Netherlands we say a brown corner to it, right? So, and in that way that allowed them to distinguish themselves, but probably also on social media. So I think racism played a role in the sense of that we know, even if we like it or not, that voters like kind of things in politics that are quote unquote new, both in terms of how they are addressed and how they are then communicated in terms of style. So I definitely think that played a role, is that populist parties on the right, they raised a line that was seen as not acceptable. And they, of course, have also linked that to anti-establishment sentiment by saying, hey, look, there is no quote unquote freedom of speech, there's political correctness, all the right parties. So they used it as an anti-establishment hammer, if you will, to kick the other parties and to distinguish themselves. So I think it definitely plays a role. Next to, this is a strategic answer, next to their own ideological commitment, maybe to some of these positions, right? But I think just to take the example of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, he left the Liberal Party, so that the current incumbent party, due to some of these elements, and he faced a strategic challenge to distinguish himself. And he went way further than he had ever done. And he, we have a lot of his background that he never really supported these ideas, but he thought that it also was very, electorally beneficial for him and radicalized throughout his career, right? So sometimes also parties start on this position, not even for necessarily ideological positions, but strategic situations, and then it's very difficult to go back. And then ultimately, the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands is a racist party. It's been called that. It's been trialed, right? So it's that's very tricky. On the inequality end, maybe Sergey wants to say something a little bit about that. But the inequality end, I do find difficult, because it's been also a bit of the puzzle and the kind of work that I'm doing now, is that would also see that then left-wing populist parties would do better, because inequality fits that more clearly. I think what populist right parties at a certain point understood, and Marine Le Pen is a good example of that in France, that to combine this more otherness with parochial redistribution elements, which highlights the otherness as well, is a very effective golden formula for these parties. And we've seen that historically, if you wanted to make historical analogies to that. But I think it raises a little bit of a puzzle, is why has the left not been able to capitalize on this inequality, for me at least?
Thanks. I would just add a few things on the last thing that Catherine said. I once again would recommend reading Jan's book in French called Origins of Populism, and there is also a paper in English, which talks about populism in France using very detailed data, exactly addressing this issue that it's not enough to think about economic drivers. You really need to understand this otherness, the identity issues, and trust and lack of trust on the extreme left and extreme right in France. However, in France, we also see this interesting trend now that while extreme right has been successful to differentiate itself from center right, now center right wants to move right. And French Interior Minister now is criticizing Marine Le Pen for being too soft on immigrants, even though he's part of the establishment. Also, our colleague Nona Meyer has done research on the shift of French center right towards the right. And also in the survey, we show quantitative research which shows that, yes, once you have extreme right clearing the threshold for parliament, then center right in Europe actually starts moving right. So there is a causal link between success of extreme right and the shift further right of a center right. So that really matters. So on the question of inequalities, those two things which I started with, globalization and automation, these things create what's called job market polarization. And this is a long-term trend we observe in all advanced economies, where jobs are created at the top of skills distribution, people with higher education, consultants, doctors, bankers, professors, engineers, and at the very bottom, like manual labor and like cleaning staff, care professionals. While in the middle, where you have blue-collar workers or routine white-collar workers, these jobs are either outsourced or automated. And so you have this very strong push from those two forces that create inequality in the labor market. And some countries respond better, and some countries don't. And so in Europe, inequality has actually not increased in post-tax incomes. In the US, it increased substantially. And then a lot of people would say, how about Sweden? What about rise of populism in Sweden? Sweden is a paradise of welfare state. And the answer is, actually, we have research on Sweden which shows that in Sweden there was a reform in mid-2000s, in mid-noughties. And this reform has actually removed some items of welfare state. And people who suffered from this reform are the ones who support Sweden Democrats and actually who run on Sweden Democrat tickets. So it's welfare state is very, very important to buttress, to mitigate those fundamental drivers that contribute to increasing inequality through this job market polarization. So inequality is important, and this is where we learn lessons. One of the things I would mention, in 2020, many politicians have read the stuff we've written and responded with generous fiscal packages. There was no austerity, and I'm very happy about this. I think we would have seen a disastrous political change if we pursued austerity policies in 2020. And of course, COVID is a pandemic which creates a lot of inequality. So people with high skills sit at home safely, work online with their savings, with their big houses, while people who are poorer, they're in the front line, they actually die at a higher rate, and they have no savings, and they have limited real estate, and they don't have internet connections and computers for their kids to study online. So this is a huge inequality raiser, and luckily states around the world, especially in advanced economies, were more generous than 10 years ago, and I'm very happy about this.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine and Sergey. Let me share additional question. I will group together some of them. So there is a first question about the use of religion by right-wing populist party, if you could say a word about that. And then there are two questions that really point to the issue of the populist party as a real revolution. Is it a real revolution in terms of the political agenda? And is it also a threat for democracy?
I can maybe start and then Sergey can add. So on the religion end is really interesting. So we also have to be very careful to put all right-wing populists, we talk primarily about them because as Sergey showed, they've been the biggest beneficiary of the collapse, let's say, of mainstream parties or relative collapse. Is to treat all these right-wing populist parties the same. So they are contextually very different. Take the role of religion, a very good example, and we have to think about structural conditions. The country that I'm originally from, the Netherlands, has had the quickest secularization in Western Europe of any other country. The country in which I reside, Italy, is a very different story. Matteo Salvini used, Catholic symbols to launch it. That would not be the case for someone like Geert Wilders. And Geert Wilders actually uses religion in a different way. So there, primarily, his sentiment is anti-Islam. And it is that the Dutch society is, quote unquote, super progressive on women and LGBTQ. We can say that, the Dutch are lagging a little bit behind at the moment, but they were traditionally, of course, very much. And that migrants coming in with backgrounds that are especially Islamic backgrounds are threatening that. So he uses religion, but in a very effective way. And I think this kind of strategy of how you see these guys are trying to really think about how it works within their ideology, and then having a more slimmer ideology where you can pick and choose from different things can be very beneficial, where, Christian Democrats or liberals often get, that's inconsistent, or journalists ask that. You hardly see actually journalists, probing populist right parties about that. And then the last point about, is this scary for democracy? Or actually we end the last chapter of the Princeton book is actually about that. So how far do you go? No, you see it also on the left. We also see movements on the left that go anti-rule of law. In my country, we've seen it also in other countries. So let me just take the right. So in the Netherlands, we had the initial breakthrough was with Pim Fortuyn post 9/11. He then, of course, was killed. Then you got all varieties of populist parties. But every time the populist party had to distinguish itself from the previous version by providing a harsher version of what was there, in order to also distinguish themselves and get, and increase the vote. So you saw that with Geert Wilders, and now you see that with Forum for Democracy, which basically is a Trumpian party in the Netherlands, 7 seats in parliament. And they have moved into anti-democratic territory, i.e. in what they are mobilizing. So I think this idea of where you innovate on markets, we want to have the best technology, but in politics, we might think that there are boundaries to where you need to innovate. So it can also be that too much innovation can have a normative implication, but also too much information can make party systems so unstable that it becomes very difficult to govern. In the Netherlands, we have 17 parties. It's proving impossible to find a coalition government, which feeds the anti-establishment sentiment. So you can get in a downward spiral, which I hope my country will not end into. But so you see some of these elements where I do think that there are now signs of where we're reaching the boundaries of what, to what extent is this normatively desirable, even though I think populist parties also put issues on the agenda that were not discussed by mainstream parties for the reasons that I've outlined, because they were not beneficial for them electorally.
I'll be brief on religion. I would say that what Catherine said is extremely important. Often populists do point to important issues, which are real issues and are not discussed by mainstream parties, Catherine correctly said. In our paper on 3G internet and populists, we also give we go through a case study of Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro ran a very skilled digital campaign because he had no TV time, being an outsider. And in this campaign, he used both fake narratives, really propagating a lot of false news, but also he pointed to corruption. And the reason was elite in Brazil at that point was fully corrupt. Both mainstream parties were involved in a big corruption scandal, and the ruling party pretty much had all leadership going to jail or impeached and so on. And in that sense, sometimes populists point to a real issue. And here is a real issue that Catherine mentioned. Some minorities you want to protect hate other minorities you want to protect. And we saw that in American election, where Pete Buttigieg, being an open gay, was rejected by some part of Democratic coalition, a minority which didn't like gays. And these are real issues that European politicians in the mainstream have to address. And some of them already say, you want to come to Sweden, you have to be tolerant. you have to accept our values, and we will be intolerant to intolerance. And so this debate needs to be had and needs to be very frank and open. And I think this is very important. On innovation, Catherine has talked a lot. I would just mention once again that populists are extremely good with social media. Those populists who are not good with social media, they don't succeed, because you cannot be a successful populism if you go through New York Times. That's not what I would recommend any populist. You have to be good in circumventing the media, which are controlled by the elite. And finally, on the threat to democracy. So one of the papers we refer to in our survey is a paper by Funke, Shularik, and Trebesh, which evaluates the last 100 years of performance of populists in power. They look at 60 biggest countries in the world, which are accounting for 95% of global GDP. And so in these countries, they find 50 populist governments in the last 100 years. And they find that first, today, we have unprecedented number of populists in power. Second, they find that populists in power underperform as economic policymakers. After 15 years of populists coming to power, GDP is 10 percentage points lower than it could have been otherwise. So why is that? Because populists destroy institutions. And they also show how populists destroy media freedom, rule of law, how they actually not improve situation with inequality. Left-wing populists actually do improve equality, but on average, populists do not. And so this is where the threat for democracy comes from. So they destroy institutions, so investment climate is worse, so economic growth slows down, and then populists say, aha, I cannot perform, I cannot deliver on my promises, and so they will vote me out, like they voted out Syriza, right? So what should I do? I should stick to power, and I should destroy checks and balances, I should undermine media freedom, I should undermine political competition, so I cling to power. And they show in this paper that populists in power usually don't just step down after losing election. They are usually kicked out after a coup or a scandal or trying to steal an election, and so on and so on and so forth. These are not just exceptions. This is the rule. Normal populist underperforms economically and then tries to destroy democratic institutions. And that creates the threat of democracy. Not because populists talk about corruption or certain deficiencies in mainstream elites. Because when populists do come to power, they underperform and they destroy political checks and balances.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergey and Catherine. I'm afraid we are running out of time, so we didn't have time to answer all the questions, but some of them relate to India, and you will see for the next panel that we have the specialist of India with Christophe Jaffrelot. And I just want to share my warm thanks to Catherine and to Sergey. And if I can share one message to the audience, read the book by Catherine and Sergey. They are really, really insightful. So thank you to both of you, to everybody. And I give you the floor, Mark, for the second panel.
Thank you so much. And the last answer by Sergey is a very good transition with our panel. So thank you, Sergey. Yes, the second panel is about populist regimes or authoritarian ones. And we have two distinguished scholars, Nadia Urbinati, which is a professor of political theory at Columbia University, and Christophe Jaffrelot, as Jan said, who is a senior researcher and one of the best specialists of India we have in France, and not only in France, and which is also president of the Association Française de Sciences Politiques. So the topic is about populist regimes, and I would like to start maybe with you, Nadia, for opening this panel, because in one of your most recent book, Me, the People, How Populism Transformed Democracy, one of your points in this book is to explain that the populists of today, maybe it's a difference with the populists of the past, are presented themselves as Democrats, but you say they are not liberals. And this is an important distinction you do in your book, which means that you think, and I think you're right, that they have a potentiality to change democracy. But obviously the question is, for what? Which kind of change do they want to do? and what do they want to create? And this is the point. There are many questions about that. First question is, how can we say that a democracy is switching to something else? This is the first point. The second point is precisely how to give, and you especially as a political theorist, which kind of characterization you could give of this experience of populism in power and sometimes populist regime, which is not exactly the same thing, because populist regime should say, we could say that it's a real change and did change. It's a kind of consolidated organization of the political system. So do you think that when you see all the different populists in power, do you think that we have sometimes experience of power, or do you think that sometimes you have really regimes and something new? But if we accept the second element, okay, there are some populist regime, what exactly they are, and especially in regard to the theory, to the political theory, could you say that it's a kind of dictatorship? Would it be better to speak of authoritarian regime, for instance, using a reference to Juan Lin's limited pluralism? Do you think that maybe we could have a new experience of totalitarian regime, which is another thing? Obviously, we could refer to Hannah Arendt or to the classical Friedrich and Brzezinski studies, but so many others. Some scholars, for instance, especially historians, I think, to Federico Finkelstein, explain that we don't have anymore to speak on populist regime, but a new kind of fascism in the world today. And or maybe can we speak about illiberal democracy as Zakaria? So we are expecting from you some clarification of all this notion as a political theorist. And I give you the floor, Nadia.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody. Well, this is the question today, because in fact, we are talking about the 21st century populism, right? We are talking about the populist kind of system that emerges in consolidated democracies. We are not talking about populism in so-called weak democracy, transitional kind of democracy, as it was in the 60s. I remember the big conference, the first important international conference in London, organized by Isaiah Berlin and Hofstetter in 1967, in which populism in the present time, 67s, was practically absent in their analysis from the US and Europe and even Russia, and it was only in the Africa and third world country, decolonized countries, so on and so forth. Then if we see another book, very important, 2002, edited by Yves Meny and Sorel, we see that populism is only in Europe, and practically Europe is the central theme. So it has to do with the transformations of the European system, also because of the growth of the European Union, and thus the decline of national sovereignty at the local level and concentration of power in Brussels, which implied in many cases a diminishing sense of sovereignty at the local level or state level. And for this reason, we have, in Europe at least, but not only in Europe, this phenomenon called populism. It is, as we know, a very complex and loose conception, an idea. And sometimes we see we see in newspapers that is used in order to attack everybody against the establishment without any distinction. So we should avoid this kind of simplification. And in my view, one important precondition for avoiding that is by distinguishing between populists as forms of movement of contestation inside of the opinion and society, and populist movements that aim at power and eventually succeed in getting or conquering a majority. So since populism is based on ideology as a bifurcation, a dualism, actually in opposition between we and them, in which the them are, as we learn by previous papers, the establishment, the political establishment, not necessarily the economic, the political establishment, then there are many movements that have these we and them, and we good, you bad, we the people, you. It's not necessarily that everybody, all these kind of movements, they are in power. Occupy Wall Street repeated this kind of dualism, but they didn't even want to have a representative seats in power, or they didn't look for representation. So representation is important then. It is important that the way in which the populist leaders wants to achieve seats in parliament, eventually majority, and they use representation to do so. So we need thus to situate populism within representative and constitutional democracy. This is 21st century populism. Representation and representation and the assault on the institutionalization of politics, that is constitution, is one of the two main important characteristics of populism. So the attack or the confrontation is against constitutional representative democracy. By constitutional democracy, we imply a separation or a gap or distinction between the institutions and those who use the institutions. By representation, we mean an electoral system capable of and functional to electing representatives of claims and by electors without any assumptions that there is an identification between representatives and the very claims and the very people. What populists do is precisely to attack both constitution because of the constitutional democracy, because of the separation between institutions and those who are using institutions, that they accuse all of them. The accusation of establishment is the accusation of those who use the institutions, and they see then the institution puts limits and obstacles to the fulfillment of the politics of the people. So they attack institutions as a smart way to put limits and obstacles to what the people want to do. So attack on institutions, and what they do when they are in power. We saw it in Italy, we saw it in England, in the United States. They occupy institutions. Since the right people is inside of the institution, institutions are to be dealt with directly. So the people is justified in using institutions. Of course, it is the right people, not the wrong people. The question of interpretation of the people and thus representation of the people is important. Let's think about the speech gave by Trump in his inaugural address in 2017. If you read the speech, you can really have an hermeneutic of populism. So first of all, he said, there have been other presidents before me, other majorities before this one, fine. But this one is the most legitimate one. Why so? So the rule of the games is not enough. The majority rule is not enough. The idea of the people in the constitution, that is the idea of the people as generality, is not enough. What is the difference? The difference is that they kind of reify institutions. They reify the conception of democracy. So not the rule of law, that is majority, but the substantive majority. Not the institutions used by all politicians, but the institutions that only the right representatives are legitimate in using. So Trump declared to be the only real legitimate majority and president. That's their only real legitimate representatives. So this is a very important, is the same. You see, they use the same institutions. They refer to the same rule of laws, but they use them in a way that is completely transformed. So that some political theorists, they use the expression of parasite. So like the parasite, they don't have autonomous systems of power. They don't have autonomous institutions. They don't have autonomous procedures. They use the one by constitutional representative democracy, and they transform it in a way that at the end of the day, it may be a very disfigured kind of democracy. So let's see representation. We saw elections, we saw majority. Let's see representation. Representation is very important in my case, because populists today in power, they come when Sergei used the expression crisis matters. Yes, they come easily when party politics, organized parties, traditional parties are into a very crisis. So they object that kind of representation that split the people into many parties. They object that pluralism in representations, and they oppose to pluralism the representation of the one. You know, the old myth of the absolute people as an absolute sovereign attachment. So one. And in relation to the people as one, the fragmentation of the people into many political parties is considered to be a trick of the few in order to get the many disempowered. So the attack on representation is very important. The kind of representation that we are seeing here, and again, Sergei and Catherine were very good when they told the story of the new media, because I called this direct representation. Actually, I discovered that this expression was used by Perron in the 50s. Direct representation, meaning I don't use parties, I don't use other strategies. I directly talk to the people, I construct the representation of the people, and the many claims, I unify the many claims into my person. This is called embodiment representation. There is a long tradition of that. It's not simply something recent. It is a long tradition, and it is very important because it precludes, it eliminates actually accountability. If I declare to be the people voice, of course, I pretend that the people wants to have an identification with me in terms of faith, not trust simply. And this way is fantastic because it's a way of talking in the name of, without putting any ideological distinct difference in the voice of the people. I am the voice of the people, as Trump used to say. Now, what is the voice of the people that is telling us? And this needs to say something about a little bit of the content. Now, constitutional democracy based on national are always they've been a very difficult mix of two important categories. Ethnos, demos. Ethnos is a cultural entity. The people or the nation is not simply the people written in the Constitution. It has a cultural, it has a linguistic, it has a religion, it has a social specificity that is very difficult to disembody from the institutions. And indeed, the ability and the strength of the rule of law and constitutional democracy is precisely when this separation is accepted on the routine basis, the separation between the people as a generality of the Constitution and the people as an instrument of ideological constructions of one specific conception of the people. So ethnos and demos. Demos is the political people, ethnos is the cultural people. And the two are sometimes in tension when the demos is not longer capable of convincing the many aspects of life in the ethnos that is talking their own language, that is representing their people. And so the ethnos makes a claim of being prior to the demos because it's the real people, the concrete people in social and cultural sense. And thus there is this claim of contestation of the real people versus the fictional people, the political we. That it operates, and I'm not an economist and I'm not a sociology either, but if I read books about the decline, and Sergei Guriev was mentioning that, it's not simply economic inequality, but when one part of the population, for instance, this in America, it's clear that these white collar, blue collar white people, middle class workers, they've no representation and no future. And so because of economic, well, I'm not capable of going through but certainly they don't have among ordinary organized parties, they don't feel to have representation. And thus they jump outside of the traditional representative system, and they look for a Caesar kind of, a Dux kind of. Now, this is the scheme, and we can, when we see a populist in power, we recognize it precisely because of these characteristics. This is more difficult to define, less difficult to recognize it. And now, Mark asked me, well, is this really dangerous? Yes, it is. Of course, democracy, representative democracy, as Bernard Manin was very capable of showing us, is connected to political parties and party organization of representation. And in the last chapter of his book, Manin ends with the audience democracy, the democracy of the public, in which the parties are weak, the identification of the parties outside of the institutions is weak. They may be inside of the institution, but outside is very weak. And thus this public finds itself into a disassociated entity that is capable. One leader through these new media is very ready to put together this public under his own image. So yes, with this new media, it's more possible to have these constructions of representative leaders. Yes, when party democracy is weak, as it is today, weak in terms of not inside of the institution, but outside, then the disaggregated public may find his representatives. There is the risk, as usual, because if democracy is so elastic to be able to go from party democracy to audience democracy, yes, there is a threshold after which something else we have a dictatorship, we have a coup d'etat. We saw on January the 6th in America how possible is this transition. But at this point, it's no longer a populist regime. It is another regime, it's a dictatorial regime. So the paradox, I would like to introduce it, the paradox of a populist democracy is that it is unstable. Either it goes back to ordinary routinized party democracy, or it jumps ahead toward another regime, and this is difficult to stabilize. So populist democracy is difficult to stabilize, and we may even say that it's a permanent electoral campaign while in government, because that cannot stabilize. The anti-establishmentarianism needs to be permanent, both when you are in opposition and when you rule. And that is this a form of authoritarianism? Well, it's so loose, the word authoritarian. It's so complex, and so there are so many classifications. Linz had 7 classifications, so it's very hard. Certainly, since there is the apical one mono leader representing the people, and this, in fact, operates much better in a presidential system, better than a parliamentary system, certainly there is this tendency to authoritarian leadership, or the idea of the executive as central more than the collective parliament, but it's not a change of regime. Otherwise, it's no longer a populist, it's something else. So we may say that populism indicates some problems existing in party representative democracy, cannot be the pharmacon, because as a pharmacon, he would kill his source of energy, that is democracy. So paradoxically, he's inside of democracy, but can kill democracy. But at that point, like all forms of parasites, they disappear. They die along with the body, thanks to which they survive. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia. We understand perfectly that we are in a situation where, in some cases, obviously, we had to take very good examples to do a verification of what you present, because we could say that we are not anymore in the representative democracy, not yet in another regime. So we are in a situation of transition, and this is a very good transition to the second case, or more the Indian case with Christophe. Christophe, recently, 2 years ago, you published a book called India of Modi, Populism and Ethnical Democracy. It has been published in French. I know it's going to be translated in English. And everybody could have the opportunity to read. So obviously, I would like to understand, and maybe the audience would like to understand, what do you mean by this ethnical democracy? Is it in the same meaning? Is it in the same sense that Nadia Urbinati doing this reference to ethnos and demos? How do you think, for instance, that you could say that India is always the most important democracy of the world? It's a common expression, very diffused. So do you accept it, or do you think that we are not anymore in this situation? And I would like also to understand how Modi do precisely to transform this most important democracy. Not only why, but how did he do? And what's your perspective for the Indian democracy, if it's always democracy, or maybe you think that it's something yet different of democracy? Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. In fact, I'm trying to respond to these questions by going beyond the case of India, because I do think that it exemplifies something we see elsewhere. And I would like to seize this opportunity for really having a conversation, I would say even a transdisciplinary conversation with non-India specialists. You know, this question of the relations between populism and authoritarianism is a very topical one indeed, not only in India. The trajectory of Erdogan, of Rajapakse in Sri Lanka, of Bolsonaro, of Orban in the EU itself, show that there is a kind of continuum between some populism and some authoritarianism. And I agree with Nadia, we need to revisit these concepts, which are very broad. And what I'm going to try to do now is precisely to be more specific. What kind of populism? Yeah. What kind of authoritarianism? And the political scientists here may have a different approach than economists. And I repeat, I'm glad that we can have a conversation that has to be interdisciplinary. Sergei mentioned a very interesting study in his presentation, according to which populists become authoritarian when they fail to deliver and therefore are led to resort to force to retain power. Well, I'm going to argue that they can turn to authoritarianism even before they fail. And for one reason that I'd like to elaborate upon, that is, in some ways, authoritarianism is inherent in populism. There are affinities between these two isms. A Weberian notion, you will see I'm very much a Weberian, that I'll try to illustrate in my presentation. So my starting point is really the paradox Mark was highlighting in the introduction. There is a populist paradox. Populists claim that they want to restore democracy, to defend the people against the establishment, and in many cases, they just do the reverse. And our analysts sometimes say, well, we have populism because of a crisis of democracy, and in fact, the crisis deepens when they take over. So we have to elucidate this paradox, and I will try to do it by showing that populism has indeed affinities with authoritarianism for at least three reasons. One, personalization of power. The populist, when he wins not because of his party, wins not even because of his ideas, he wins because of his personality. And if we turn to theories of populism, I think Pierre Ostigi is probably the one who shows the more convincingly that there is a special relationship between the man and the masses. And I don't need to elaborate on that, but I find really convincing the idea that he can express the resentment of those of the bottom, speaking like them against the propriety of the elite, being also a victim like them, victim of the media, victim of the establishment precisely, even if he is part of it. And on the other hand, he's the hero, he's the savior, he's the one who protects them, endowed sometimes with supernatural qualities. Never forget the popular culture that can sometimes go that far. And in a way, we are back to Max Weber. This is charisma. What is charisma for Max Weber? Not necessarily saintly politics. Huh? It can be a bad man, the charismatic man, but he's exceptional. He does exceptional things. And in the case of Modi, because I can flesh that out a little bit, the fact that he organized military strikes against Pakistan. Nothing of that kind had taken place since 71. That was clearly one of the exceptional achievements that made him out of that world, literally. So when the populist wins elections, he can capitalize on this success because it is his electoral success. And therefore, immediately after he is in office, he will pick and choose for his ministers. Nobody will have a say in the making of his cabinet. He will also take his MPs for granted because they've been elected because of him only, and so on and so forth. So the first affinity is there. The man is embodying power in the conquest of power, and naturally in the way power is exerted immediately afterwards. Secondly, the populist, because he is the people, because he epitomizes the people, delegitimizes very easily his opponent. Dissenters are out of legitimacy. They are anti-national. They are, of course, representatives of the elite. Therefore, they are, in a way, impure or at least corrupt. And in many cases, they are accused of being cosmopolitan and in relation with foreign countries. And they lose legitimacy for this very reason. In the case of India, again, Sonia Gandhi, who was born in Italy, could not be a legitimate opponent. In fact, we are back to what Levitsky and Ziblatt say in their book on Our Democracies Die. We are already in some authoritarianism when we don't look at our adversaries as anything but enemies. And they are not interlocutors you can talk to. That's true of other dissenters. Most of the populists are very, very anti-NGOs. Look at Orban. Anti-universities. Look at Orban again. And of course, in India, this is the first casualties are on that side. Third, the populist is also inclined to authoritarianism because he is above institutions. And that's something Nadia has already mentioned. How can the judiciary object anything he says if he is the people, if he has the legitimacy coming from the people? And there is the very, I would say, deep contradiction between legitimacy and legality. You may be legal, you're not legitimate because I am the spokesperson of the people. Well, here we see how the populists promote the demotic side of democracy at the expense of the liberal side of democracy. Democracy is a coin with two sides, and you can't remove one except at the expense of the other. So if you do not realize, if you do not respect the rule of law and the institutions in charge of the rule of law, inevitably that will result in a form of authoritarianism. And it's true of the judiciary. We have seen this in so many countries where judges have been transferred. The way judges are appointed has been transformed. So populists in Sri Lanka, in Hungary again, in India for sure, have been the collateral casualties of populism immediately after populists take over power. We could say the same thing about the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, the bureaucrats lose their authority the moment the populist takes over. Now, when we've seen that, when we've said, well, there are affinities between populism and authoritarianism, we have not said much because these two concepts are so broad. And what I'd like to do in this second part, briefly, is to revisit these two notions. Well, I'm more interested in national populism than in populism at large. National populism is a very interesting variant of populism that Gino Germani in '78 has theorized, saying, well, you have populists of the left. We know what they do. We know who they are. In Europe, there are plenty. They were there also in Latin America. And you have populists of the right. For them, the people is made only of the son of the soils. The sons of the soil, who are the ethnos, indeed, as Nadia was saying. So you do not claim to promote and defend everybody, but the majority. In another word, we have majoritarianism as a synonym for populism, national populism. Well, that is something that has affinities with another kind of authoritarianism that indeed I call ethnic democracy. Well, I'm not the first one to use this word. In fact, this is a word, this is a notion that has been introduced by Sami Smoua about Israel. Israel exemplifies ethnic democracy. This is a country where you have certainly an electoral system, a parliament, Supreme Court, a judiciary, a free press, but some citizens are more equal than others. So there is a majority, a de jure majority, that gives to the democracy an ethnic flavor, and therefore is a form of authoritarianism because all the citizens are not equal before the law. Well, the national populist systematically promotes ethnic democracy. De facto, not necessarily de jure, but most of the time it begins with a de facto transformation of the way you deal with the minorities, and gradually this is written in the law, and gradually it becomes a de jure ethnic democracy. So that's the first specific type of populism that I would compare to a specific type of authoritarianism, because I do think that ethnic democracy is a form of authoritarianism. We have to be very careful with all the understatements we are using these days, illiberal democracies, ethnic democracy. Well, we have to make sure that the word democracy is not undermined by this kind of use. Authoritarianism may be moderate, but illiberal democracy is already authoritarianism. The second point I want to make is that populism usually goes along with a specific kind of authoritarianism that we call electoral authoritarianism. Now, this is a formula that a German author has introduced, Andreas Schädler, and I think in a very productive manner. Populists need elections. This is from day one, this is the only reason why they are legitimate. And they need this legitimacy vis-a-vis the institutions. Never forget that everything begins in a democracy. We are looking at something we should have said before. No, populism is a product of democracy. You don't find populism elsewhere. So the question is, how do populists transform the democracy in the context of which they have flourished in the first place? Well, they have flourished in the first place because they have been elected. So they have to constantly return to the voters. But they can't lose elections. So you have this very specific kind of distortion of popular preferences that the populist will have to engineer one election after the other. And sometimes voters have to vote again. You know, when Erdogan was not happy with the electoral results, he asked the voters to vote again in Istanbul. But they have to vote. There is no way you can circumvent this. So all the strategy of the populist will be, how do we win elections for sure? And that's where authoritarianism results in distortion of institutions. The bureaucrats have to be transferred in order to have the right man at the right place when you have to count the ballot papers. The judiciary has to give its assent to any electoral results, and so on and so forth. So this is another variant of authoritarianism that goes with populism. And the last one is indeed something we find in Juan Linz. Juan Linz indeed has a typology of authoritarianism that comprises of 7 categories. And you wonder how good a typology can be when it is that diverse. Well, there is one type that goes very well with populism, and that is sultanism. By the way, something coming from Max Weber again. Huh? The sultanic regime or sultanistic regime is something you find in Max Weber. For Juan Linz, sultanism is defined by 3 things: arbitrariness, arbitrary regime, of course, patrimonial and nepotistic dimensions, and privatization, some privatization of violence. Well, that works very well with populists turned authoritarian leaders. Of course, arbitrariness is largely the outcome of the essence of populism, as I have defined it before, because the populist has emancipated himself from institutions. So he is necessarily in a position to be arbitrary. Patrimonialism and nepotism are very important because to fight elections, to saturate the public sphere constantly with the media Sergei was mentioning, and we all know about, that's costly. Certainly, social media are not so expensive, but think about holograms. You know, Modi used holograms as early as 2012, in fact, and it was very costly. You need a lot of money for saturating the public space, especially a country that is 1.3 billion large. How do you do that? So the cronies are the ones who will give the money. And therefore you have a political economy of populism that is very close to what Linz say, political economy where the rulers demand gift and pays off from business for which no public accounting is given. Populist regimes are corrupt. Most of them are really badly corrupt. 2, these cronies are in a position to establish quasi-monopolies. Oligopolistic trajectories are obvious almost everywhere. In India, it's fascinating. Gautam Adani, who was a nobody only 10 years ago, is now the number 2 after Mukesh Ambani in the hierarchy of businessmen, is typical of this kind of cronism. And 3rd, the economy is subject to considerable governmental interference for extracting resources. Most of these populists are not for a liberal economy. They are for a kind of dirigism. And last but not least, very important for the authoritarian populist to control dissent by resorting to some privatization of violence. So you will always have some private armies, some vigilante groups. Look at Filipinos and Duterte, it's a case in point, but also infiltration of the intelligence services, and of course the army, to make sure that this kind of control is very much guaranteed. Well, when we reach that point and say some types of populism have affinities with some types of authoritarianism, there is a question that comes to mind. Is that what the voters wanted? Voters voted for democracy. Voters voted for a man who would restore democracy. They end up with a dictator. And in some cases, like in India, they vote for him again, not once, but twice. Well, this is the conclusion I would like to end with, the question I would like to end with. What if voters, by supporting populists, were not looking for more authority? Did they vote for populists because they want more democracy, or did they vote for populists because they wanted more authority? When you look at the usual Pew Research Center surveys, you realize that the disaffection for democracy is so great that, for instance, in 2017, out of 34 countries, only 23% of the interviewees were committed Democrats. What did they want? Not more liberty, not more equality, more security, because they felt vulnerable. And to promote security at the expense of liberty made sense in many of these countries. So that's one explanation that needs to be probably investigated. Another explanation, and I'll close with this, is who is badly affected in an ethnic democracy? Minorities. Do minorities matter when you have election processes as the regular processes for designating the rulers? Not so much. So for the majorities, even if there are some, I would say, collateral casualties among the minorities, and if the strong man gives security, that may be good enough. So I think we have to certainly ask ourselves whether the question is not only populist against democracy, but people against democracy. And that's exactly the title of the chapter that will be published in English, coming from the book we co-edited with Alain Dikoff and Elise Massicre 2 years ago, Populistes au pouvoir, because I do think that this question now is well, worth asking.
Okay, thanks a lot, Christophe. Obviously, you share some integrations very important, and the last one, obviously, is not so new, because we know since La Boétie, le discours de la servitude volontaire, we know just after the World War, second one, the famous small book of Carlo Levi, La paura della libertà, the fear of the liberty. So maybe in sometimes it depends on the context. People prefer security, protection, authority than freedom. And this is a philosophical integration more for Nadia than myself, but obviously we have to think about that. And I would like just to do a nuance before taking so many questions, and I will have to select some of them, that obviously we insist a lot on the threat, on the risk for democracy with the populism, and we are obviously we are interested by the impact of the populist on democracy. But we have also to think to what does democracy do to the populist? Because some democracy have capacity of resilience. In USA, as we saw, dear Nadia, in Italy, in the present time, democracy has capacity of resistance, of resilience. And the populists sometimes have to integrate the institution, because there is a capacity of the institution to resist. that's a good thing, that there is always a capacity of resilience. For how many times, I don't know. We have some questions, and I'm sorry for the audience. I'm going to select some of them. For Nadia, the first one by a spectator anonyme. You mentioned identification in the context of populism. Could you tell how is the process of identification mobilized by the right-wing populist and how by the left-wing populist? In other words, do you think there is a difference between the right-wing populist and the left-wing, or do you think it's exactly the same thing? For this question of the embody of the people, because your great thesis, your great argument is to say, we are the people, people one. So do you think there is a difference, or they are, for in your opinion, or more exactly with your analysis, exactly the same thing?
I would say that I don't think that there is a difference between right-wing and leftist populism. Populism has, in the first panel, this came out, more sympathy with the right than the left. Why? Because populism is based on the exclusionary. First of all, excluding, defining themselves by exclusion, not them, us. And to make exclusion the central theme of politics is something very, very problematic for the left, particularly when the exclusion is not simply the leader class or the bourgeois, but is the exclusion of those who are the immigrants or those who are different from us. So I think it's problematic. This is the question with Chantal Mouffe. It's very hard to define populism from the left. Unless you don't consider every form of leftist a kind of populism. No, populism is very conservative, it's more authoritarian, and has to do with the conceptualization of the we against them that ends up by simplification. It's a simplification that ends up by the disclaim even those who are in the minority. I don't think so, in fact. And moreover, just to add what Christophe said, which the presentation is absolutely unquestionable for me, it's perfect. This idea of this capability of reifying institutions and procedures, majoritarianism, is not simply the use of the method of majority to count and to define, you win tomorrow and then you lose tomorrow. All majorities are the same if they count a majority. But for them, only one majority is the good one. So they use the word and they apply it to something that has nothing to do with majority rule. It is the power of the majority. So there is this transformation of language in a way that it seems to be the same, but it's not the same when it is operational. And this is very complex. And so I exclude, in my view, a populist from the left either end up to be another kind of populist, of leftist party, or is not. Look at the Podemos case. Podemos they were born as a digital party with a leader, very plebiscitary kind of, but they enter in a regime, in a government, and they transform themselves day by day into an ordinary and traditional parties. So for me, it's very problematic to define the right and the left. Actually, the question I would like to pose, how to react against populists in order to stay within democracy? How we can exit from populism? What is the exit of populism? The terrible one is, of course, that we know, Christopher was very good in describing the bad way out. Is there a positive way out? And this is where institutions play the game. In my view, the strength of the American case, or the strength of many European cases, is institutions. Is the constitution, what we call it constitutional democracy, is institutions. They resist like a ditch against the charismatic leader who declares to be the people. And that is, in my view, very, very, very important. Very important, yes.
Thank you, Nadia. I'm sorry for you, Christophe, because you did a very wide argument on populism and a big reflection, very interesting, but you did not speak so much of India. And you have many questions about Modi. Does Modi is more corrupt than the predecessor? How Modi did with the COVID and what does he do exactly? So what's the future of Modi, more or less? I think you could take some minutes to give the answer because you are really the great specialist of India. Sergei also wanted to know something about India.
Sure. No,
So please take some minutes and give some answer to so many questions. Obviously, we have other questions more general about populism and democracy, but I think you have to do
No, definitely. But I'd like to reinforce the point Nadia has just made. Institutions are the way out. Few countries have institutions as robust as the American institutions. And this is precisely the problem. And this is precisely why the US should exert pressure on countries, including India, because that's probably one of the ways to respond to one of the questions on India that is on the chat. What is the way out? Well, the way out for me is this one: external pressure, nothing else. Or you wait for the, well, there are other possibilities, but you wait for the great man to leave the scene. That's one of the possibilities for the cycle to be over. By the way, when Maduro took over from Chavez, you saw how difficult it is for a populist to succeed a populist. So we see that the life cycle of the leader is possibly the life cycle of the regime. And last but not least, of course, in the case of India, we can also mention this. This is what Devika asked, I think. A revolution, a real social upsurge. And this is what we see repeatedly, demonstrations in the street against, for instance, the law that is making Muslims non-eligible to citizenship. That was in 2019. Then you have the farmers' movements in the street. But frankly, these social movements to dislodge such a strongly entrenched government will have a very tough time. So really my three hypotheses are external pressure, the end of the leader's life cycle, and the revolution come last. Well, I have a question that I find very interesting in a comparative perspective on corruption. I'm asked, and I think rather ironically, do you think that BJP's Modi is less corrupt than Congress? Certainly not, but the kind of corruption is different.
Yes,
and it has to do with sultanism. Sultanism, as I said, implies strong relations with cronies. So a handful of people will give, and you will have a kind of oligopolistic market of corruption that will go together with also a much more dirigist economy. I mean, less liberal economy. So the amount of money collected may not be terribly different. The channels will be different, and that makes a difference in terms of the robustness of the regime.
May I?
We have really 2 minutes, so please, Christophe, did you finish?
Well, I had other questions, but I don't want to prevent Nadia from speaking.
So please, Nadia, just 1 minute.
Because what you said is so important. I mean, I think it's important because there is an element in populists, even when they create coalitions of claims, and because they have to be very quick in making them happy. So they use immediately state money and so. It does this presentism. They have to do it as quick as possible.
Yeah,
and
true. Because excuse me. Because it's the temporality of
exactly, because of the temporality
of emergency.
And this
absolutely
is an escalation. This is an escalation of corruption in relation to party organized parties. They can wait They can wait next time. He cannot wait.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll take one last question, maybe, Mark, because it's a very important one that is asked by Chetan, who asks many questions, but I take only one. In the case of Modi, I should have said that there is a party behind, there is an organization behind. And this is precisely why I speak of national populism. You know, it's a bit like Erdogan, by the way. Erdogan is not only a personality; he has an organization behind. He is a product of the organization. And what is very interesting is this organization could not seize power on its own for 60 years, and he brought the plus vote. He brought the populist dimension that brings more people behind him. So all what we know about populism. The big question now for the party who has promoted him is what after him? You know, it used to be a very collective party. It was a pyramid. Now it's a pyramid on its head. When the head disappears, an organization like this one has to find a successor. And he has made sure that nobody could campaign with him. So there is no second range of leadership. They are all eliminated.
This is the same thing with Berlusconi. We decided not to create and develop the party. And this is another topic, maybe for another forum, which kind of relationship there is between the populist leader and the party, or not a party, a movement, for instance. Okay, I'm really sorry because I see that there were so many questions, but it's really impossible because Sergei is going to be prisoner in his office if he does not get out, because we are at Sciences Po and we have to get out immediately. If not, we're going to spend all the night here. So it's absolutely impossible. Thanks to the audience, thanks to all the panelists. It has been a very, very stimulating moment. And I remember you that next week we will have Cogito, the magazine of the scientific direction, with a special issue on populism. We are 30 scholars in Sciences Po, at Sciences Po, who are studying populism. A part of them participated to this Cogito, but many others are doing other research. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Many thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.